This time on Boneyard Revivals, we are going to be identifying and reading RPO codes off of our 1985 Oldsmobile Cutlass. And when I say RPO codes, I'm not talking about run or pass options in football, boys. Calm down, Jalen Hurts fans. We're going to be talking about regular production options for this 1985 Cutlass. Let's get into the video.
Get an apple in her, bud.
So first things first, let's discuss it. What is an RPO code? As I said in the intro, the RPO code is a regular production option. So what did this car roll off of the factory floor with for options? And we're talking multitude of things. We're talking engine type, transmission type, axle type, gear ratio type within the axle. We're talking interior pieces. What type of seats did it come in? What type of windows did it have, electric or hand crank? What type of stereo did it come with, AM, FM, or AFM, cassette, whatever, options like that. I pulled a bunch of them off of our 1985 Cutlass to try to figure out some of the history on it, and let me tell you, we found that and then some that kind of helps us identify this car and what it would have looked like coming off the showroom floor, and then also gives us some history on the car that is up to determination. So with that being said, let's get into it. So the first things first, we actually have to be able to identify and find where our codes would actually be. GM usually did some sort of a label, and for this car specifically, and I think of a lot of other G-body cars, they actually printed out a label and put it on the inside of the trunk deck lid. We'll show you that here now. Basically, you can find that simply by opening your trunk and looking for the RPO code sheet. Now, I'm not going to go over every single RPO code that is on this sheet, but you can find stuff online, give you the breakdown of what those codes mean. I'm going to go over some of them that I found interesting for this car that kind of paint the story for at least the most important things that I cared about the car, and basically what kind of makes this car what it is, so I know build-wise moving forward what we actually have here on our hands. Now, of course, some of this stuff might not be accurate. One of the things I did want to discuss too was the fact that this car was repainted at one point in time. You can tell that by some of the body work that's been done on this car that I think I've mentioned in previous videos. And if you haven't seen any of videos on this car, make sure you go check them out. I'll leave a link right here for you, so you can go check out the entire playlist and see what we're doing and what our plans are for this 1985 Oldsmobile Cutlass. But anyways, let's get into the RPO codes. I pulled off a bunch of the codes that I thought were interesting, and of course I'm going to be sitting here using my iPhone because I'd be lying if I said I remember the codes offhand, so I'm going to look like a little bit of a nerd reading them off my phone. However, some of the codes that I wanted to go over that were kind of important, that kind of basically gave this car some identity. One of the first ones I wanted to go over was code LV2. LV2 is designated for the 307 Oldsmobile, which is obviously in this car. You can verify that by checking the block number. There usually is a casting number somewhere on the block. I know this is a 307 just by being able to identify it. The next thing I wanted to go over was the MV9/MX1 code. Now the MV9 and the MX1 are two different codes, but they combine together. They kind of tell you what you need to know. Basically that says it's either for transmission, it's either a THM 200 or a 204R. The 204Rs were a 4-speed automatic. Some of the interesting facts on that is that they were arguably one of the best overdrive transmissions that they put into their that GM put into their 80s cars. I would argue that it's slightly better than the 700R4, and the reason why I'd argue that is most specifically because of the gearing. So just for a comparison here, we can actually see our gear ratios between the 700R4 and the 204R. So your first gear ratio for the 700R4 was 3.06 to 1, as the 204R is 2.74 to 1. So basically the 700R4 is a much lower gear, and basically that could be good and bad. I think a lot of people don't like the 700R4s because of the shift point between first and second gear for how low of a gear first gear is, as the 200R4, like I said, is that 2.74 to 1. Looking at your second gear ratios, you have in the 700R4 a 1.63 to 1. So think how drastically of a shift that is from first gear to second gear. You're going from a 3.0 1.06 to 1 ratio to a 1.63 to 1 ratio. So, and I have two vehicles that actually have 700 R4s in them, our square body and our Chevy S10 that you've both seen here on the channel. And I can tell you personally, just driving those, that first to second gear shift is just honestly really awkward. It's not close together, so it's not quite as a smooth transition shift. Both of those transmissions tend to shift a little harder and just a little bit more awkward going from first into second gear. It's just a 700 R4 thing. It's not like it's necessarily bad, but you know, that's just the difference between it. Then of course, third gear ratios for the 204R and the 700R4 are both 1-to-1, which in case if you're looking for reference to that, 1-to-1 is also the third gear for the Turbo 350s and the 400s. So as the Turbo 350s and 400s are obviously only 3-speed automatics, their third gear, which is their final gear, is a 1-to-1 ratio, as the 4-speed automatic transmissions that GM offered in these cars actually had a fourth gear, which allowed for a lower gear, or excuse me, a higher gear than that, which allowed for better cruising RPMs down the highway, which then meant lower RPMs while cruising down the highway, which is where you get your fuel economy from. So fourth gear for the 700R4 was a 0.7 to 1, as the 204R is a 0.67 to 1. So the 0.67 to 1 is a higher gear than the 0.7 to 1, which is honestly a little better in my opinion, because that means you're going to be cruising down the highway at a much lower RPM than you would be in a 700R4, depending on what your gear ratio is. So if you have a 700R4 and a 204R that are both in a similar vehicle, same engine, same gearing. So just for an example, this is a 307 Oldsmobile, obviously, and they offer the 307 Oldsmobile not only in Oldsmobiles, but in even some Chevy applications. But let's just compare this Oldsmobile. Now, all these Oldsmobiles, as far as I know, came from the factory with 204Rs. The 700R4s were very popular in a lot of the Chevy vehicles, but they even had, you know, Oldsmobile 307s in some Chevys, like Chevy Caprice wagons and stuff like that. They had 307s. It's a lot to take in, I know. But let's just take this vehicle for instance. Let's just say this vehicle is obviously a 307 Oldsmobile with a 204R, and then you're comparing it to another vehicle that has a 307 Oldsmobile with a 700R4. Both identical vehicle, both weigh the same amount, same engine, two different transmissions. Your rear gear ratio in the back, let's just say it's a 323. Now with a 323 gear combined with your 0.7 to 1 ratio that the 700R4 provides, it is going to run, let's just say you're going down the highway at 70 miles an hour. It is going to give you a higher RPM to run at 70 miles per hour because the 0.7 to 1 is a lower geared ratio than the 0.67 to 1. You understand what I'm saying? You kind of keeping on. It's kind of hard to think about it too, because even gear ratios too, when I say lower and higher, the higher gear is actually the smaller number and the lower gear is actually the bigger number. So a 411 gear in the rear of a car is actually a low gear, because you have to think about it in the sense of math, and when your rear, you know, your differential, how it all works and it comes together inside the pumpkin, it's your turns per that one ratio. Basically, the point that I'm trying to make is a 411 gear is obviously a lower gear than a 323. Some of the great things about having a lower gear, and honestly, what I would consider a lower gear is anything like a 373 and lower. So a 373, 410, 411, 412, 456, you know, anything that's actually be a bigger number than 373. Honestly, like there's some 345s and 355s and stuff like that that came from some stock applications and GM stuff. That whole conversation basically leads us to our next code that I wanted to go into, which is G72. The G72 code identifies as a, you ready for this? A 2.14 to 1 rear gear. This car is an 85. It was right in the middle of GM's smog era when they came out and produced a lot of these cars. We'll talk about some of the engine stuff later on in this video with the 307, that there's kind of how it all kind of comes together. GM's idea was to make the most efficient car that they could. This Oldsmobile obviously offering a 307, smaller displacement engine. They did a lot of smog stuff, like this engine originally had a smog pump on it and all that garbage to basically try to lower emissions. And with that also being said, they wanted to make them more fuel economy friendly, which is the reason why this thing has 214 gears in it. Now, an interesting fact is that if you have an Oldsmobile Cutlass that is not a 442 or a hearse car, it will only have 323s or higher gearing in it. There was no Oldsmobile Cutlass, Salons, Brohams, whatever, that actually offered a rear gear lower than 323. Why was that something they did? I don't know. You think they'd throw a few more options in there. I imagine if you wanted to custom order something from the factory, you could. But most of the times, it is going to be a 323 or higher gear. This car happens to be a 214, which is the lowest, or which is the highest gear that you could put in these cars. So this thing is an absolute turd out of the hole, which I noticed that too. Even that video where we tried to do the burnout, it just was gutless out of the hole. It had nothing. And it was kind of pathetic. And now reading that VIN code, or that RPO code, I can understand why it is so gutless now.
Just don't understand them. One wheel. Even used water. Gutless.
Now, I mean, you have a 307 that makes what? Maybe 165, 170 horsepower, and what? Maybe 175 foot-pounds of torque at, let's just say, 2,500 RPM. Maybe a few more RPM than that. And you're trying to make this thing do a burnout with that high of a gear. Yeah, it will spin the tire forever, but to get it going right off the gate there, it's going to struggle a little bit, which is something that we saw. Now, can we change that? Yeah, absolutely. There's ring and pinion gear sets that you can get. So if I wanted to throw a 373 in this or something, we most definitely could do that in the future. Now, is that something that I want to do right out of the gate? No. No, I'm not looking to do that straight out of the gate. My goal for this car is just to get it up and running at this point. But there's that. So there's your rear gear ratio code. The next code I want to go over is V2E. The V2E is directly corresponding to the suspension. It was a standard suspension. It was nothing trick. It was basically whatever they had off the showroom floor is what it came out with. But something I do want to mention is that someone was messing with this car, at least the shocks. It does have aftermarket shocks in it that look like they were supposed to be drag racy-ish shocks. Whether that's actually true or not, I don't know, but they are an aftermarket shock in this car. Next code I want to go over is Y78. The Y78 code is designated as identifying this car as a Cutlass Salon. Now, there's so many different ones, and honestly, I'd be lying if I could sit here and tell you I knew the difference between every single one. Obviously, they have different models, the Cutlass Salon, the Cutlass Broham, the 442, the Hearst option. Let's just paint it straight to you, at least in my opinion. The two cars that are the most valuable, that matter the most, is the 442 designated cars and the Hearst cars. Cutlass Salon, yeah, it's cool. This thing did come with some pretty nice options from the factory and was a nice car, but does that mean anything to me personally? Yeah, it kind of identifies the car as what it was, but besides that, it really doesn't tell me much other information. The next code I want to go over is YT1. That is a deluxe door panel trim. Now, if you look at this car actually has kind of tricked out a little bit for being what it is. As you could tell, it's, you know, when it comes to door panel trim, it has all the special you know, chrome pieces and wooden pieces and all that stuff that are kind of still somewhat intact to the car. Some of the stuff is missing, but honestly, looking at the car, it's either in the trunk or it's in the other car. It's because that's where it all kind of got put. But yeah, so from the factory, it had the deluxe door panel trim, which I thought was kind of cool. The next code I want to go over is AR9. That would identify the seats in this car as being sport bucket seats. Now, if you want to get really interested here, I was told that the entire interior out of this car was stripped out and put into the Street and Strip car that we have, the Street and Strip Cuddy as it is known here on the channel. And that code would identify that the interior seats that are in that car right now are actually truly indeed the true seats that were in this car right here. So thought that was kind of cool. The next thing I wanted to go over, the next code, CO4. CO4 would identify that this was a Landau top. Now, if you want to know what that means it was a vinyl top car. And interesting about that is you can actually tell on some of these cars, obviously it's not a vinyl top car now, but something that is very interesting is that also our street and strip car was also a vinyl top car. You could tell that by the bodywork that was done on it, and even with this car here, I'll throw up some clips now of actually showing you where the bodywork was done, where the mud was added, where the vinyl top was. I personally don't like the vinyl tops, especially if you don't have a nice dry place to store the vehicle, mostly because the moisture will sit there and collect up under the vinyl and it will rot out the rooftop. Plus, I just don't like the way vinyl top cars look. I just never did. And when I say vinyl top car, it wasn't the whole top. It was from the back window back, basically, to the rear window. But again, I was not a vinyl top fan. Next code I want to go over is D55. That would identify this car being a console with a floor shifter. That's pretty impressive considering that this car currently has a column shifter in it, and you can see where the shifter went. But it was also a floor shifter car originally from the factory. So I don't know if the columns got switched or whatever, but this car did have the floor shifter from the factory, which is pretty cool, honestly. That kind of made or break one of these cars, in my opinion. One of the other things I want to go over, the next one, N91. Are you ready for this? This bad girl rolled out from the factory with wire wheel hubcaps. If you've never seen what those look like, I'll throw up an image off of Google right here, right now. And will you just look at that? That is pristine, guys. That is sexy. I love me some wire hubcaps. Definitely was not a performance-looking car. It was definitely an old man car. The next RPO code that I wanted to go over here was 79C. That would give the indication for the ruby red cloth interior, so the seats, the carpet, and the headliner is going to be ruby red, which really does suggest that the interior in the race car right now is truly the interior out of this car. It makes complete sense if that's, I mean, obviously the numbers are correlating with the fact that that's that color interior, and honestly, I'll be honest with you, the ruby red interior in these cars and even the Monte Carlos and all the other G-body cars, in my opinion, were my most favorite color. The dark blue was nice, and you know, they had some grays and I think a few other different colors, but the ruby red, in my opinion, was the best factory color interior in these cars. I'm infatuated with the red, and I think the red looks super, super good, which is cool that everything lines up that this car had the ruby red interior. The other thing I wanted to go over too was the code AC3. AC3 stood for a 6-way power seat. So as you know, this car has, on the driver's side, power seat, and the actually has electric windows and locks on the driver's side here, which is kind of cool. Also kind of not cool at the same time for me, because now if I want to make all that stuff function when we go to drive this car, I actually have to like sit down and figure that stuff out, which is kind of annoying, but at the same time too, hey, it's a pretty nice feature. And from the factory, I know this thing, there's a few other codes that I looked up. I don't have them here in front of me, but I know that it had like a heated back glass and some other cool intricate interesting interior pieces like that kind of made the car. I know for a fact this car was an AC car from the factory, so overall I'd say it was a really, really decent car rolling off the factory showroom floor. So a few puzzle pieces that I did want to go over is the fact that when we got this car, it had 14-inch Oldsmobile Rally rims on it. Obviously those are not original to the car. Somebody along the way had to buy those and put those on. Obviously, we already talked about the bodywork that was done to this car to get rid of the Landau top, or the Landau, however you say it. Someone's going to correct me in the comments. But it had that top, the half vinyl top, which I personally was not a fan of. And besides that, it was a, nothing special, 307, 204R, which is still originally in the car. I believe it's the original tranny to the car. How is it not blown up and in a gazillion pieces right now? I don't know. But then also out back we had two 14 gears. I'm still crying over the fact that there's two 14 gears in this car because this thing is a dog. But we do have some plans in the works for this to help that. Getting into the 307 now, there's some information that I pulled off that I thought was interesting on this car. So obviously it's a 307 Oldsmobile. It's a 5.0 liter V8. Compression ratio from the factory, you ready for this? 8-to-1. 8-to-1 compression ratio on this 307.
Cutlass.
What a dog. Apparently it had 148 wheel horsepower and it had 250 foot-pounds of torque. I was wrong on my original torque number, but these Oldsmobile motors were always known for their torque, especially like the Oldsmobile Rocket 350s. The 307s, obviously not as popular as the 350s, but still, you know, they made pretty decent torque numbers. That's what these engines were known for, and that's why this engine with the transmission combination and the rear gearing, the fact that it made a little bit more torque for being a 5.0 honestly helped it out a lot, and honestly made these cars, even with the, you know, super high gearing that they had, still a decently good driver. So that's one thing that even driving this car the few times that we did on the street, yeah, it was gutless, but it did what it had to do. And honestly, on the highway, this thing would probably be an absolute cruiser. Is that what I want out of this car? No, not at all. We're building muscle cars here. We're trying to do big smoky burnouts and have fun. So kind of not the combination you want for that, but if you want a good driver to go on like Power Tour or something, you know, you got the car. But again, why would you want to have a good driver and get good fuel economy when, you know, you'd rather do burnouts, you know, even on Power Tours? So, you know, whatever. When it came to Oldsmobile and this combination of the car for this Cutlass, honestly, it kind of works out with the 250 foot-pounds of torque, with your 4-speed automatic with the 204R, and then your rear gear. That little bit of extra foot-pounds of torque, especially in a lower RPM range like these Oldsmobiles like to run, honestly was actually arguably decent for the car. Now, if you actually put a decent rear gear in this car, like if this car had like a 373 or something, like the you know, the 442 cars actually ran pretty well with the 307s, and basically 442, if I'm not mistaken, was 4-barrel carb, 4-speed automatic, and then posi rear, so 442. I believe that's what that was, if I'm not mistaken. But with this car, obviously just being a regular Cutlass salon, it only had 307, had terrible gearing. The 214s in this rear, when I looked up that RPO code, I actually kind of started crying, simply because of the fact that it just proved to me that this car indeed cannot get out of its own way.
Cutlass.
Great highway cruiser, but not something that you want to see. But again, with the engine, with it making the foot-pounds of torque that it does, you know, it kind of makes up for it a little bit. With a lot more rear gearing, this car would actually be a pretty fun driver. One of the other things I want to go over too with this 307, there's two cylinder head casting number designations for these 307s. One was a 7A and the other one was a 5A. You could actually find this on the cylinder head itself. If you look on your driver's side, it's going to be on the front of the head. You can find that, I'll show. Obviously, there's the clip of, you're seeing the clip now of it, where to actually locate that. There was also a 6A head, but as far as I saw information I could dig up on that, that was only in Canada, so I don't think it's really relevant for the conversation. Plus, they were such an oddball head that they were barely on it. If you most likely have a 307, it's going to be a 7A or a 5A designated head. Also, what you have to watch out too for is you actually come back looking at your VIN code, which is usually on the driver's side bottom right corner of your windshield. If you look in the windshield, you'll see that the tab that's actually mounted inside of the car. There is two different VINs. There's a VIN 9 and a VIN Y. That will actually dictate what cylinder head that car got. We have the 7A head, and the other cars came with the 5A head. So just for comparison, when it came to the cc chamber size, the 5As were a 67 cc chamber, as the 7As were a 64. The 64 is going to be better than the 67 simply because of the smaller your combustion chamber is, the more compression you're going to have potentially. Your port size, and this is where, see, everyone now everyone would like to argue that the 5A head was better than the 7A head because of this statistic here. The port size on the intake was 1.3 1.30 by 2.03, as the 7A was 1.30 to 1.30. Basically, the intake port on the 5As were bigger than the 7As. But the one thing that I do like about the 7A heads is that they were the swirl port designed head. And the swirl port designed head, as you know, kind of relative to the small block Chevy world, these heads basically had an actual swirl design in them that basically was supposed to mix your air and fuel ratio in a swirl motion, which actually helped atomize the fuel and air mixture better. It was supposed to be better for low-end torque, which obviously the 307s are more torque monsters than they are horsepower makers. So when it comes to what head's actually better, honestly, if you have a 307 Olds, reliability, I mean, they're great engine reliability-wise, but when it actually comes to having a motor that makes horsepower numbers, you might as well just throw it in a garbage and honestly either step up to an Olds 350, or if you want to get really crazy, track down a big block, or the easiest thing to do is, because if it's a GM motor, just get yourself a small block Chevy, or even a big block Chevy. They were putting these as well. There's a few guys that have done it. But one of the things I wanted to go over too is obviously your intake and exhaust valves compared to the 5A to the 7A. Your intake valve size for the 5As was 175 valve, the same with the 7As, and your exhaust valve was the same size as well, it was a 150 exhaust valve, so for both. So same valve size. What are the only differences? The intake runner, the port size, was a little bit bigger on the 5As, but within having the 7A with the smaller combustion chamber, with the fact of the swirl port design, I personally would like to argue on the 7A's behalf. A lot of guys on paper are going to say that the 5A head's better, but let's be honest, it's a smog, junk pile of garbage anyway, so what's the difference, right? What's the difference? But my personal opinion, I like the 7A heads better, just looking at the CC size and also the fact that it was a swirl port design. Something that's really cool about this engine that I didn't realize was that this actually has potential. I want to confirm it before I just throw it out there and say it, but I'm pretty sure this is a hydraulic roller cam engine, which is pretty wild. Apparently came with 1.6 rockers from the factory, which I could pop the valve cover off and actually confirm that or not, but apparently came with 1.6 rockers, and the information I found on the cam size is lift-wise, it is a 395 on the intake and a 402 on the exhaust, which that's next to nothing. That's just stock cam sizes for a lot of stuff. The fact that this thing potentially has a hydraulic roller cam in it is pretty wild. We can potentially confirm that later. I don't care enough now to rip the whole motor apart just to find that out or not, but there you have it. There is your listing of our RPO codes. We went over the 307 that's in this car and gives us a basic rundown. Now, I do have one special piece for you here that I want to share with you right at the end. I was going through the trunk of the car and found some insurance cards and some registration cards, but I also found this. So from what I was told, this car was originally from the southern part of Pennsylvania. And obviously I'm not going to disclose the previous owner's name or his address or anything like that I found on the registration cards, but that all confirmed that. There was also this piece of paper from one of the local police departments. You ready for this? So it's from the local police department down there from where this car initially came from. And it has an incident number on it, the type of incident, and the officer's name that reported on site. This car apparently was involved in a hit and run. I'll actually show it to you here. Here you go. Apparently this car was involved in a hit and run, which I almost kind of want to change the name from Black Betty to the Hit and Run Cutlass, but I'll let you guys pick that one. But that does actually explain something kind of interesting, because this whole front header piece was repainted and some of the paint's chipped away. You can actually see that this original front clip was like a bright metallic blue. So did this car get involved in a hit and run? Yeah, I get kind of says so, don't it? Great. I'm gonna have the police showing up at my door for a hit and run, and the guy never probably showed up for the court date. And then they're gonna come to take the car back, and then they're gonna see that there's street signs in it as 4-pans. I'm just signing myself up to be in trouble here, aren't I? But I just thought it was a cool little piece of information that I found there in the trunk. But that kind of tells us a story on this 1985 Oldsmobile Cutlass. Hope you guys did enjoy this video. I thought it was kind of cool. We got to see some of the history on this car and kind of learn its background and its story, which me personally, I love finding that stuff out because it kind of tells you where this car came from. And obviously, now we kind of get to write the story on where we're going to take it, which I think is super cool. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching as always. Hope you learned something and got something out of this video. If you did, consider subscribing. I'm not telling you have to, but it'd be cool if you did, and I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned for more awesome content like this. We have a lot of work left to do on this Cutlass here. We're currently in the midst of getting it back together, running and driving, where we can get her out on the road and just beat it. Ruthlessly beat it. And either this 307 is going to survive or it's not going to survive. But anyway, if you want to see more content like this and a whole bunch of other automotive content that we do here on this channel, make sure you subscribe and check out the channel. But we'll see you next time here on Boneyard Revivals. Thanks for watching.
Cutlass.